There's a strong chance the most beloved cowboy in modern animated film history carries the actual name of a real man that almost nobody today can identify on sight. A two-way football star good enough that his name still quietly rides along inside a billion-dollar franchise decades after he died. And when that same man finally passed away, the newspaper of record for the entire industry that had used his body and his talent for over 40 years summed up his entire life in a two-word headline that somehow managed to leave out nearly everything that actually happened to him. His name was Woody Strode, and once you hear the full list of what he lived through, it genuinely sounds too large to fit inside one single lifetime. These are the Woody Strode stories that sound completely invented until you see the record behind them. Number 10. A body claimed by the regime that hated him. Long before Woody Strode ever appeared in a single film, his physical presence had already crossed an ocean and landed in the hands of people who despised everything he represented. While competing at UCLA in the late 1930s, his physique caught international attention, striking enough that artist Hubert Stowitz painted a nude portrait of him specifically for a touring exhibition of athletic art tied to the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Nazi officials shut that exhibition down once they realized it featured black and Jewish athletes side by side. That didn't stop German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl from photographing him regardless, and a promotional image of Strode, produced under the direction of the Hitler regime itself, still circulated around the Berlin Games that year. A black man's body, held up as propaganda by a government actively built on the idea that his existence was inferior. That contradiction followed Strode for the rest of his career, the same way audiences would spend decades noticing his physical presence first and almost nothing else about him second. Woodrow Wilson Woolwine Strode was born on July 25, 1914, in a working-class stretch of south-central Los Angeles. His father, a brick mason with mixed Creek, Blackfoot, and African-American heritage, once laid 2,500 bricks in a single day, hands so calloused that Strode later said getting hit by them felt equivalent to being struck with brass knuckles. Though the man himself refused to teach his son the trade, telling him instead to go to school and learn something else entirely. His mother, the daughter of a formerly enslaved woman with Cherokee ancestry, connected him through his father's side to an African warrior who had escaped a Louisiana sugarcane plantation generations earlier and found refuge among the Creek people. Strode later said he grew up genuinely unaware of race as a child, attending a grammar school with a black principal and believing, in his own words, that there was nothing on the Pacific Coast he and his friends couldn't do. It wasn't until he traveled beyond Los Angeles that the rest of the country made clear exactly what it thought of men who looked like him. A growth spurt in junior high transformed a tall, thin kid into an all-city football captain and all-state track athlete at Thomas Jefferson High School. And when his grades initially blocked a scholarship offer, he simply studied on his own until he forced his way into UCLA regardless. Number 9. The most integrated backfield in college football. At UCLA, Strode developed into a genuine two-way end and a legitimate world-class decathlete, winning the 1938 Pacific Coast Conference shot put at just over 51 feet when the world record itself sat close to 57, clearing the high jump bar at 6'5" and finishing fourth nationally at the NCAA championships. But what actually made those years historically significant wasn't Strode's individual statistics. It was the roster around him. The 1939 UCLA Bruins fielded 4 black players at a time when most college football programs across the country had none at all: Strode, Kenny Washington, Jackie Robinson, and Ray Bartlett, 3 of whom became known together as the Gold Dust Gang. Years before any of the 3 most famous names among them would go on to reshape American sports individually, they were already sharing the same field, quietly disproving something much of the country still refused to accept. That 1939 squad finished the season 6 wins, 0 losses, and 4 ties, ranked 7th nationally, with Strode leading the team in receiving at 15 catches for 218 yards. They played eventual national champion USC to a scoreless tie in front of over 100,000 fans at the Coliseum with a Rose Bowl bid on the line. Jackie Robinson would go on to break baseball's color line, Kenny Washington would help break football's, and Woody Strode would actually break it first, before either of his more famous teammates, in a story that almost nobody remembers today. Number 8. The men football tried to erase. Professional football had effectively banned black players since 1933, not through any written rule but through an unspoken agreement among team owners that functioned just as completely as one. For 13 straight years, not a single black man played in the National Football League. Locked out entirely, Strode and Washington spent those years playing for the semi-professional Hollywood Bears instead. During World War II, Strode joined the Army Air Corps, spending much of his service loading bombs onto aircraft across Guam and the Marianas while also playing football for his unit's team at March Field. By 1946 he was already 31 years old, and any realistic shot at a professional football career appeared to be over. Then circumstances shifted. When the Cleveland Rams relocated to Los Angeles, the franchise needed to lease the publicly owned Memorial Coliseum, and black journalist Hallie Harding pushed back hard, arguing that any team wanting to play inside a taxpayer-funded stadium in that city would need to integrate its roster first. The Rams signed Kenny Washington on March 21, 1946, and at Washington's own direct insistence, signed Woody Strode as well on May 7. Alongside Marion Motley and Bill Willis of the Cleveland Browns, the four of them became what history now calls the Forgotten Four, the men who reintegrated professional football a full year before Jackie Robinson ever debuted in baseball. The experience itself was genuinely bitter. Both men were already past their physical prime, and Strode, at 32, played only that single 1946 season, catching 4 passes for 37 yards before being released. He spoke afterward about the racism he faced, the limited playing time he received, and the deliberately excessive physical punishment opposing Southern players inflicted specifically on black athletes. Team owner Dan Reeves reportedly also disapproved of Strode's interracial marriage. But a league north of the border was about to offer him something America never had. Number 7. The only perfect season in Canadian football history. In 1948, Strode signed with the Calgary Stampeders of Canada's Western Interprovincial Football Union, and what followed genuinely reads like something invented for a film script. That season, Calgary went undefeated across 12 games with 0 losses, the only fully perfect championship season in the history of Canadian professional football, a record that still stands today. Strode led the team in receiving and earned an All-Star selection. In the Grey Cup Championship against Ottawa, he caught a pass on what became known as the sleeper play, then recovered a critical fourth-quarter fumble that directly set up Calgary's winning touchdown in a 12-7 victory. The team returned to the Grey Cup the following year but lost to Montreal, and shortly afterward, Strode's football career ended the way so many eventually do, with 2 broken ribs and a shattered shoulder that left him saying it felt like he'd gone around with heavyweight champion Joe Louis. At 35, with his body broken and no football left to play, Woody Strode needed an entirely new direction, and the one he chose next was one nobody could have predicted. Number 6. Trapped for life by his own body. Strode's third career began inside a wrestling ring. By 1950 he had become professional wrestling's first black star, competing across California and Canada against the biggest draw of that entire era, Gorgeous George, while also teaming with fellow black wrestling stars Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright, billed at one point as the Pacific Coast heavyweight champion. The pay ran around $500 a week, but the more important thing the ring taught him was how to move, how to make physical conflict look completely real, and how to command a room's full attention using nothing but his own body. That skill would soon completely redirect his life. Producer Walter Mirisch spotted him wrestling and cast him in a jungle adventure film in 1951, though the studio first wanted his head shaved for the role and he was initially hesitant, only agreeing once they offered the same $500 rate, later joking that he was suddenly out in the world with a bald head, trapped for life in his own words, in what eventually became simply the shape his entire career would take. Through the 1950s, Strode moved through a steady parade of exotic supporting roles. African warriors, gladiators, jungle natives, even a literal lion in one production he later called the physically hardest job of his entire life. His sculpted 6'4" frame opened nearly every door in Hollywood and simultaneously locked him firmly on one side of it. Directors consistently saw a warrior, a servant, a gladiator, but never a romantic lead and never the actual star of anything. Cecil B. DeMille hired him as a $500 a week background performer for the Ten Commandments in 1956, and when no other actor could adequately fill the role of the King of Ethiopia, DeMille simply elevated him into it, giving him a regal entrance that left a lasting impression. Pork Chop Hill in 1959 finally gave him his first genuinely serious dramatic role. And it was on that same studio lot that a chauffeur eventually approached him, saying an old man wanted to meet him. A man who would go on to fracture his sense of self, push him to his limits, and ultimately turn him into a real actor. Number 5. The gladiator who wouldn't kneel. Before reaching that old man's story, one role from 1960 deserves its own moment entirely. In Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus, produced by and starring Kirk Douglas, Strode played Draba, an Ethiopian gladiator armed with a trident and net and ordered to fight Spartacus to the death for entertainment. His wrestling background made every movement in that fight scene look completely genuine, and Strode later said he would have lost the role entirely without both his physical conditioning and his wrestling experience, since the choreography required real skill to execute without actually injuring himself or Douglas. Draba wins the fight, pinning Spartacus beneath him. The Roman crowd demands he finish the kill. Instead, he looks up at the aristocrats watching from their private box, and hurls his trident directly at them in one final act of defiance, and is killed for it by the character played by Laurence Olivier. His death is what actually ignites the slave rebellion driving the rest of the entire film. Just a few minutes of screen time left audiences genuinely shaken in 1960, and film scholars have since read Draba's sacrifice as a direct metaphor for the civil rights movement itself, a black man choosing death over submission on screen at the exact moment the country was having that same argument off-screen. The role earned Strode a Golden Globe nomination for Best Supporting Actor, making him the first black actor ever nominated in that specific category. Olivier reportedly told him directly on set that what Strode was about to do in that scene was something Olivier himself could never have pulled off, a comment Strode later said gave him all the confidence he needed going forward. And yet, even after Spartacus, even carrying a Golden Globe nomination, Hollywood still refused to give Woody Strode top billing on anything. It took one particular old man with a camera, a temper, and a genuinely complicated relationship with race to finally hand him something bigger. Number 4. The role that carried a whole race across a river. John Ford sent his own personal driver out onto the studio lot specifically to track down Woody Strode. "I hear you're trying to become an actor," Ford reportedly told him once they met. And when Strode confirmed it, Ford said simply that he had a small job for him. That small job turned out to be the title role in Sergeant Rutledge, released in 1960, the first major Hollywood Western built entirely around a black lead character. A Buffalo soldier from the 9th Cavalry falsely accused of assaulting and murdering a white woman along with killing her father, his own commanding officer. Warner Brothers wanted established names like Sidney Poitier or Harry Belafonte for the part. Ford refused outright, reportedly saying plainly that neither man was tough enough to be what he needed Sergeant Rutledge to actually become on screen. The film arrived 2 full years before To Kill a Mockingbird, making it one of the earliest mainstream Hollywood productions to confront American racism directly rather than around its edges. Strode later called it his favorite role of his entire career, saying it carried genuine dignity, and quoted Ford as having personally given him the line describing how no black man had ever ridden across the screen the way he rode across the Pecos River in that film, adding that he had done it himself and, in his own words, carried the entire black race across that river on screen. Ford's directing method behind the scenes was frequently merciless. Before one crucial scene, he deliberately got Strode drunk the night beforehand so the resulting hangover would visually read as physical weakness from a gunshot wound. Strode later said the old man hadn't just directed him, he had genuinely split his personality apart, admitting he nearly had a breakdown during production, but that the experience is ultimately what turned him into a real actor and put him properly in the saddle for the rest of his career. Ford treated him almost like a son, and by Strode's own account, he genuinely needed that closeness at the time. Strode himself admitted he carried a certain roughness that Ford specifically responded to, something Strode said traced back generations. But Ford's actual racial attitudes remained deeply complicated throughout their relationship. And Ford openly used his friendship with Strode as a shield against accusations of prejudice, once claiming his best friends included Strode and a caretaker who had worked for him for 30 years. On the set of their next film together, Ford would demonstrate exactly how willing he was to weaponize the man he called his son. Number 3. The quiet target behind Liberty Valance. By 1962, when Ford directed The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, he cast Strode as Pompey, the loyal ranch hand working for John Wayne's character. In the film's most quietly devastating scene, Pompey stands in front of a schoolroom attempting to recite the Declaration of Independence from memory, gets through the opening lines, and then falters completely, forgetting the specific phrase declaring all men created equal. James Stewart's character gently tells him that a lot of people forget that particular part. In a single unspoken moment, Ford said more about American racial reality than most filmmakers manage across an entire career. In another scene, a bartender refuses to serve Pompey a drink, and Wayne's character roars back that nobody says he can't, personally pouring one for him. Later, Pompey saves Wayne's character, drunk and suicidal, from his own burning house, the servant rescuing the master in the film's single greatest act of loyalty. Behind the camera, Ford played a considerably crueler game. When James Stewart casually remarked that Strode's costume looked a bit reminiscent of an old racial caricature, Ford summoned the entire crew and announced publicly that Stewart apparently disliked black people, a comment that left Stewart genuinely humiliated in front of everyone present. Strode had effectively been weaponized in a conflict that had nothing to do with him personally, and he later admitted it took him years to fully realize Ford had been using him as a tool to psychologically unsettle Stewart the whole time. On that same production, John Wayne, absorbing Ford's relentless verbal abuse throughout filming, nearly came to blows with Strode directly, and Ford reportedly called out from his director's chair not to hit him, since they still needed him for the production. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance eventually entered the National Film Registry in 2007, one of 4 separate Strode films that now hold that designation. The fourth opens with what many critics still consider the single greatest sequence in the history of cinema. Number 2. 10 minutes that made silence unforgettable. In 1968, Sergio Leone opened Once Upon a Time in the West with a sequence that broke nearly every rule of conventional filmmaking. 3 gunmen arrive at an isolated train station in rural Spain and simply wait for nearly 10 agonizing minutes while almost nothing visibly happens. A windmill creaks. A fly crawls across Jackie Lim's face. Water drips slowly and steadily onto the brim of Woody Strode's hat. No dialogue. No score. Just 3 men, the desert, and the sheer weight of time pressing directly onto the audience. Strode stands through the entire sequence with the patience of a man who had genuinely waited his whole life for exactly this kind of moment, which, in a very real sense, he had. Then Charles Bronson's harmonica-playing character steps off the arriving train, a brief exchange follows, and all 3 gunmen are dead within seconds. That single sequence took 4 full days to film and remains regularly cited among the greatest opening sequences in cinema history. And Woody Strode, standing silently in that dust with water running down his face, became a genuine icon of the entire genre without speaking one single word of dialogue. He had spent his whole career quietly turning silence into something powerful, on a football field where his play spoke louder than any interview ever could, inside a wrestling ring where his body alone told the entire story, and now in a Spanish desert where simply doing nothing became the single most memorable thing in the film. One chapter of his story still remained, the one that reveals exactly who Woody Strode actually was underneath all of it. Not the athlete, not the actor, but the man himself. Number 1. The floor beside a dying man's bed. When director John Ford was dying of cancer in 1973, Woody Strode didn't come to him as an actor or as a former colleague. He came as a son. For roughly 4 months, Strode slept directly on the floor beside Ford's bed, present whenever the old man needed water, present in the middle of the night whenever the pain became unbearable, and present at the very end. This was the same man Ford had psychologically manipulated for years, weaponized against James Stewart, and nearly broken emotionally during the filming of Sergeant Rutledge, a director whose complicated racial attitudes resist any simple final judgment. And yet Woody Strode still slept on that floor, night after night, until it was finally over, a single fact that says more about his character than almost anything else in this entire story. After Ford's death, Strode did something else the American film industry had never fully allowed him to do. He moved to Italy, and for the first time in his career, he actually became a leading man. The chapter of his memoir covering that period opens with 3 simple words, "Thank you, Italy," and he wrote that the country had genuinely made a star out of him, calling it, in his own words, the Promised Land. His finest Italian role came as the lead in Black Jesus, playing a Christ-like revolutionary figure loosely based on assassinated Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, the only true top-billed lead role of his entire career, and the only time his name ever appeared first on a movie poster. He later reflected that race functioned differently in the international film market, saying he had played nearly everything except an Anglo-Saxon character, joking that he'd have taken a role as a Viking with blue contact lenses and a blonde wig if offered one. In 1940 he had married Princess Luana Kalealoa, a full-blooded native Hawaiian woman and distant relative of Queen Liliuokalani, Hawaii's final reigning monarch, later remarking that the reaction from white Hollywood at the time made it seem like he'd married a major movie star instead. They remained married for 39 years until Luana passed away from Parkinson's disease in 1980, and Strode remarried in 1982. He continued working steadily into his final years, appearing in The Cotton Club, Posse for director Mario Van Peebles, and finally in Sam Raimi's The Quick and the Dead alongside Sharon Stone, Gene Hackman, Russell Crowe, and Leonardo DiCaprio. Though he didn't live to see that final film's release, it was dedicated to his memory. Woody Strode died in his sleep at his ranch in Glendora, California, on December 31, 1994, at 80 years old, and was buried with full military honors at Riverside National Cemetery. The New York Times ran his obituary under a headline that simply read, "Woody Strode, 80, character actor," a description that somehow followed Spartacus, Sergeant Rutledge, Liberty Valance, what many consider the greatest opening sequence ever filmed, the reintegration of professional football, an undefeated Grey Cup season, and the birth of black stardom in professional wrestling. Film critic David Shipman later wrote that Strode possessed a striking screen presence and suggested that, had he been born white, or simply born later, he very likely would have become a genuine star in his own right. Real recognition mostly arrived long after it should have: a Golden Globe nomination in 1961, induction into the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame in 1980, the UCLA Athletic Hall of Fame in 1992, and finally, nearly 3 decades after his death, formal recognition from the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2022 as one of the sport's forgotten 4. Pixar reportedly named Sheriff Woody in Toy Story partly in his honor. Jet magazine once called him the Jackie Robinson of cinema. In every part he ever played, no matter how small or how limited by the era's own racism, Woody Strode brought genuine dignity to roles written as nothing more than stereotypes: warriors, slaves, gladiators, servants, and made every single one of them recognizably human. He stood 6'4" and, in his own quiet way, dared anyone watching to look away. 3 separate careers. 3 separate barriers broken. And at the very end, when the man who had shaped so much of his life lay dying, Woody Strode didn't give a speech about any of it. He didn't write an essay or hold a press conference explaining what he'd done. He simply walked into that room, lay down on the floor, and stayed there until it was over. His name was Woody Strode, and if you didn't already know it before today, you do now. So here's what I want to know from you. Out of everything you just heard, which single chapter of Woody Strode's real life surprised you the most? The athlete, the actor, or the man who slept on the floor? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.